Path of Exile is one of the most popular ARPGs on the market today, with peak player counts reaching up to a whopping 209,000 players over the course of its lifetime since first releasing in October of 2013. The game is still popular today, and chances are if you're watching this, you've probably already heard of or even played Path of Exile for yourself. Recently, a whole bunch of veteran Path of Exile content creators, gaming journalists, and big-name personalities were invited to a very prestigious event in Los Angeles, California, to watch some of the new gameplay from the upcoming unreleased sequel, Path of Exile 2, and even try out the game for themselves. Now, for some reason, I was invited too. In some weird fever dream twist of fate, a guy that has next to no experience with ARPGs and only about 30 hours in Path of Exile after some very last-minute cramming, was asked to go to an event with some of the biggest names in the category. But hey, who am I to turn down the rare opportunity to leave my basement, meet some like-minded neckbeards, and play some unreleased video games? So anyway, thanks to the guys at Grinding Gear Games for the invite to this event and for sponsoring this video. If, like me, you've been living under a rock and have never really touched Path of Exile before, hopefully you'll find these first impressions useful, and if you're one of the game's veterans, please don't crucify me if I say something dumb because I don't play this game usually. Okay, good, let's get into it. So first things first, I had 3 classes to choose from in this little play session: the Warrior, the Sorcerer, and the Ranger. Being the absolute edgelord that I am, I had to pick the outright coolest looking class of the 3 and went with the Ranger. I was also told after a few hours I got to play that this was the easiest class of the 3, at least by general consensus, which made me feel significantly worse about myself after how a couple of my encounters with the bosses went. I got a little time with the other classes later, but this was the one that I spent the most time with by far. Now, the first bit of time was essentially spent in a tutorial section where I was able to learn the basics of the game, from attacking to a new dodge roll feature that I believe was only really included as part of abilities in the first game, and as someone that isn't really familiar with ARPGs, it was a really nice surprise to be able to choose whether I wanted to use my keyboard or my mouse for movement purposes too. With the first Path of Exile game, you were only able to use the mouse to move, but for me as someone with limited experience, the keyboard controls felt much easier to just drop into. Now, I didn't play much of the first game, but I do specifically remember starting off the game being on a beach where you were washed up on the shoreline with nothing but the clothes on your back. Path of Exile 2 starts the exact same way, and the opening sequence was pretty basic since I was yet to acquire any real abilities, with a dead simple boss encounter where I was able to learn mechanics and get familiar with a new stagger bar under the boss's HP that caused them to be stunned once filled, before accessing my first trading and quest hub after that boss's defeat. That said, it did give me some upgrades in terms of items, I got my hands on my first abilities, and I was on my way into the next area, feeling pretty confident about myself. That was until I met this bitch, the Carrion Crone. Now, to describe what it felt like going from the first tutorial boss to this rage-inducing grandma with more back problems than Quasimodo, it was like going from the last year in primary or elementary school to the first year in secondary or high school. Nobody likes you, you get bullied, you feel a bit lost, and Brad probably spills your juice box at lunchtime to make it look like you p***ed yourself. F*** you, Brad. All this to say, I died many times fighting this boss, and even had to take a bit of a break where I went around just mindlessly murdering some other much weaker stuff for a bit so I could calm down and come back. Eventually though, I finally managed to beat the Carrion Crone and was rewarded with an item that increased my cold damage resistance by 10%. I'm not sure if that was for every area or whether it was permanent, but either way, pretty handy. I also grabbed a necklace which gave me a bit of passive health regen. Now, what's interesting about this particular boss was the sorts of conversations I ended up having with other creators and gaming journalists that were also at this event in the same room, and how they felt about the fight. fight. Needless to say, basically everyone struggled with this, and I went away feeling pretty good about myself that I was able to take it down after a few repeat tries. But there were some people in the room playing the warrior or the sorcerer that just found this boss absolutely infuriating, to the point they gave up after about an hour of trying the same boss and just decided to move on because she wasn't actually part of a questline. It was at this point that I found out I was playing, at least out of these three classes, the easiest by far, and I probably wasn't quite as naturally gifted at ARPGs as I might have thought. Now, if you're asking for my thoughts on this encounter and how difficult it was, which I'm going to assume you are, and you'll have to be okay with that because this is pre-recorded and I like to hear myself talk a little bit too much, it was probably a little bit too tricky for this stage of the game, and that seemed to be a bit of a running theme with what we got to play in this little demo. That said, I actually really enjoyed the challenge of it coming from games like Project Zomboid, where everything is out to kill you and it's notoriously difficult to play. I just realized that not everybody will feel the same, because by my understanding, games like this are supposed to be a bit of a progressive ramp where things get gradually more difficult as you go through the game, and especially after you hit max level. This was quite literally the first boss after the tutorial, and people were struggling hard, so perhaps some tuning needed so that significant amounts of players aren't turned off by this one, but still an incredibly enjoyable experience for me personally, and I'm sure many other people will enjoy that challenge like I did. It's also worth noting that because the Carrion Crone wasn't part of a questline, you could have always opted to get some more levels before coming back to her, of course. I just wanted to challenge myself. Next, I took a brief soiree into somewhere that could only be described as the horror-based fever dream of Willy Wonka's intestinal tract, and met these annoying assholes that came out of the walls as you were walking by them. But more on this area later with one of the other classes, and we're going to skip forward to the Old Forest, where I was looking for a Tree of Souls. It was actually quite idyllic in its own way. Lots of nature, greenery, and mysterious low-lit environments that were actually kind of soothing. The werewolves in this area were a bit of a challenge for a ranged class because they closed the gap quickly, and as of yet I didn't have any massive movement abilities to help or any slows. Still, I was able to make it through in one piece, and once we arrived at the Tree of Souls, it was off to acquire some items from the Red Veil. This area gave an appearance similar to the Old Forest, only that it had been overtaken by some kind of fungal infection, and good god, what are those things? I feel like I'm experiencing a budget monster movie version of Teeth. Thankfully, to combat these new threats and to take on some of the bigger hordes of enemies I'd faced so far, I had a good host of abilities available at this stage, and I'd taken some notes from the developers on how abilities of a similar element could chain together in some interesting ways. Let me break down how these abilities were working at this stage. So my first ability I had chosen was one that hits a target and then chained lightning to extra targets nearby. I also had another ability that would land an electric arrow in a target, only to charge up and explode a few seconds later into a lot of damage to that particular target. So I had a couple of really useful tools already, but when I combined these with my last ability, things got really interesting. The last ability in my repertoire at this stage landed an arrow that acts as a pylon on the ground. Every time electricity chains to that pylon, it essentially extends that electricity's range and shocks anyone around the pylon again. So put enough of these down and you can see how this would make very quick work of a large group, which, as you're seeing in the background footage, was incredibly handy for this area. A nice little touch with shock damage was that it had a chance to apply a debuff to a target, which increased incoming damage even further. So again, super useful for both large groups that I was chaining electricity to, but also larger enemies that needed a bit more punishment to take them down. The next boss on my journey showed himself at the end of this questline in order to collect the last of the 3 items I needed before returning to my quest giver. He was known as the Rust King, but to be quite honest with you, he was the king of nothing in this particular instance, and I managed to down him on my first attempt pretty easily. Now, if I hadn't made it clear already, I really enjoyed my time with Path of Exile 2, and I'm excited to play it when it comes to a full release, but I think this was probably one of my main complaints about the game. I'm not sure whether the pacing was just a bit off, the difficulty needed to be changed on some bosses, or just that certain classes were better suited to particular encounters. But for me, to be able to just rock up and kill this massive guy built out of metal on the first attempt, but die many times to an old lady in the woods, just felt a bit wrong. That said, all of the encounters are impressive for different reasons, whether it's some of the absolutely kick-ass animations or the graphic effects behind their abilities, but there's certainly some work to be done when it comes to the balancing of bosses' difficulty ratings. For now though, it was back to the Tree of Souls where I handed in my quest, acquired my first movement ability known as Escape Shot, which I criminally underused, and got the next stage of my quest to search for an old manor. I spent a hefty amount of time here getting lost in a fungal forest with enemies that were a little bit akin to the zombies from The Last of Us, but after I was done wandering around like a headless duck for a while, I did manage to find my way into the next area, which was a graveyard, and most importantly, where I could find the entrance to the manor, which, being the quite possibly ADHD having gamer that I am, I immediately ignored as soon as I found the entrance to an entirely different area because ooh, shiny. So anyway, into a creepy mausoleum. Now, the mausoleum itself was a really interesting section because there were some enemies in here amongst all of the normal trash mobs that posed a real challenge. Specifically for me as a ranger, the Eternal Knights were an absolute pain to deal with, but at the same time, they were a very satisfying encounter, and I'll explain why. Each time I shot at them, they'd put a shield up and start to reflect my attacks back at me, causing a pretty hefty amount of damage if I wasn't careful. I came up against them a few times before I eventually realized that the best way to deal with them was to close the distance, make them lower their guard for an attack, and then pummel them whilst their guard was down. I'm willing to bet this would probably frustrate a few ARPG players because it naturally meant I had to slow down and leave these guys for last, then deal with them in the proper strategic manner rather than just blowing through them with lots and lots of ability usage. But I actually really enjoyed it. It was something that meant I had to actually engage my two-cell brain and work out the best approach, and that was pretty satisfying on the same level I'd imagine that a lab chimp feels when it figures out how to access food through a complex puzzle. My monkey gamer brain does in fact love dopamine. On top of the Eternal Knights with the shields, there were some courtesans with some pretty nasty ranged attacks, and even some special enemies that buffed the trash around them, making for some pretty close encounters at times. This was honestly one of the most satisfying areas I got to try, just because I felt like I was being challenged before I even hit the next boss. That boss was Draven, the Eternal Praetor, who made quite the introduction for himself. I'd acquired another ability shortly before this fight called Vine Trap that slows enemies for me, but that didn't stop Draven from absolutely bodying me on the first attempt like an American football player going up against the skinny kid. Still, whilst a pretty pathetic first attempt, it did serve as a learning opportunity. This boss was incredibly quick to close the distance, but his ranged abilities were manageable, so the best thing I could do was put an emphasis on keeping my distance and poking at him from range, which, thankfully for me, my class was really good at. The next encounter went a lot better, and I think this one really shows off some of the graphical upgrades between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. The abilities employed in this fight, mixed with the animations of the boss itself and the surroundings, were just awesome. Like, the whole experience was just pleasing here. I felt like it was the appropriate amount of difficult, it was challenging, and I felt like if I did make a misstep, I'd be punished pretty heavily. Getting to watch some of the graphical effects going on whilst fighting him was just the icing on the cake. Eventually, I bested Draven, and this was my last boss encounter for this character. Having got about 2 to 3 hours of playtime out of the Ranger, I figured it was a good idea to try the other two classes, those being the Sorcerer and the Warrior. Now, the Warrior was a really fun one, because unlike Path of Exile 1, directional blocking comes into play, and whilst I didn't get too far with the character, they did have some very fun early abilities, like a rolling ground slam, and the combat just felt a lot more involved than the Ranger did, and I will admit, as a result of that, things were significantly more difficult with both the Warrior and the Sorcerer than I had experienced so far. Even the first tutorial boss as the Warrior had a couple of close calls for me, and once again reinforces the the fact that maybe there's some tuning to be done for the wider player base. Now, I saved one of the boss fights here to show you some footage from the warrior and the sorcerer's point of view. This boss is the Devourer, who's basically just a big worm-type insect with extra appendages, and that's just like one of my worst nightmares, to be honest. Now, for context, I beat this boss on the first attempt as the ranger, and it's the second boss you come up against after the tutorial zone. As both the warrior and the sorcerer, this was a much more grueling experience. My sorcerer was so weak that even one or two slip-ups would ultimately mean my death, which happened more than once. And with the warrior, because I had to engage in melee combat, the fight turned into something out of Dark Souls and progressed at about the same pace as Boris Johnson trying to get to his point.
Forgive me. Forgive me. Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World.
Still, I did manage to beat the boss as the sorcerer, and that was enough for me. Overall, Path of Exile 2 was a very enjoyable experience, and I'd like to say a massive, massive thank you to the developers at Grinding Gear Games for inviting me to this kind of thing and for sponsoring this video. Like I said, I'd never been to an event like this. I'd certainly never been asked to go with everything covered and paid for, so this was very much a dream come true for me, and I still really can't believe that this has happened. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to you guys that are watching this. Obviously, I know this won't cater to as much as my usual audience, but for those of you that are watching this, it's probably safe to assume that you're one of my regulars, and I really, really wouldn't be getting opportunities like these without you, and I think it's important for you guys to know how much that means to me. Path of Exile 2 is releasing soon, and if you're interested in giving it a try when it does come out on Steam, you should head over to their Steam store page and wishlist the game ahead of its release. Thanks for watching, folks, and I will see you all in the next one.